Good evening. My name is Lynn Thomas, and it's my great pleasure as chair of the History Department to welcome you to the final lecture in our 2012 History Lecture Series. Thank you so much for attending. Once again, it's wonderful to see so many alumni and friends of the department in the audience tonight. I deeply appreciate all the enthusiasm that you've expressed for this series and your ongoing support of the department. I also want to thank 5 fantastic staff members in the History Department, without whom the series would not be possible. So those staff members are Stephanie Starkovich, Matt Erickson, Jerry Park, Cassie Atkinson-Edwards, and Bryce Barrick. Thanks to them. I also wanted to thank for their support of this series Judy Howard, our divisional dean in the social sciences, as well as Carolyn Black from the Office of Advancement, and also all the people at UW-TV who have helped to produce such a fantastic series for us. Now, before introducing Professor Margaret O'Mara, I would like to say a few words about next year's lecture series. As you may know, 2013 is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed an executive order proclaiming all slaves in the Confederate States to be free forever. To commemorate that momentous event in U.S. history, next year's lecture series will explore the intertwined histories of slavery and freedom in the United States. 4 of the Department of History's outstanding faculty members will tell this important and fascinating story by commencing in ancient Rome. So ancient Rome was often the touchstone for thinking about slavery within the U.S. And then the lectures will proceed to examine the rise of racial slavery in the United States, its abolition through the Civil War, and then its ongoing legacies that stretch up into the present day. The 4 professors who will deliver these 4 lectures are Sandra Joschel, who's a historian of slavery in ancient Rome, Stephanie Smallwood, who is a scholar of the slave trade between West Africa and the Americas, Stephanie Camp, who's a historian of race and slavery in the U.S. South, and Moonho Jung, who's a scholar of Asian American history and labor and the aftermath of labor in the wake of abolition, the abolition of slavery. So all of these professors are outstanding scholars and teachers, and I very much hope that you'll join us next year for that lecture series. So the series will commence on October 22nd, and it'll run for the following 3 Tuesday evenings. So with news of next year's series fresh in your minds, let's now turn to tonight's topic, Pivotal Tuesdays. In the preceding 3 lectures, Professor Margaret O'Mara has analyzed the presidential elections from 1912, 1932, and 1968. And what she's demonstrated is how each of those was a game-changing event. Each of those elections embodied and then inaugurated the U.S. political landscape. Tonight, Margaret will turn her attention to the 1992 election, when Bill Clinton defeated George Bush Sr. and Ross Perot to win the White House. This, in fact, is a White House that Margaret knows quite well. Because as you perhaps know already, before earning her PhD in U.S. history and becoming a very accomplished academic, Margaret served as a staff member in the first Clinton-Gore administration. So to learn about her experiences in that administration and much, much more, please join me in welcoming Professor Margaret O'Mara to the stage and thanking her for her tremendous performance throughout this lecture series.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be back. I chose to end this series with an election that was just long enough ago that we can step back with some historical perspective and analyze its meanings and its legacies. To many of us in this room, 1992 hardly seems like history. Others of us might feel differently. After all, nearly 100% of this year's UW freshman class was born after 1992. Now, a disclaimer. This election does connect to my own personal history. From June to November 1992, I was a full-time paid staff person on the Clinton-Gore campaign. I worked on the presidential transition team, and then I spent 4.5 years as a political appointee in the White House and elsewhere in the executive branch. My lecture tonight will include some observations and personal experiences that I had working on that campaign and in the administration. But my intent here is to do what I've tried to do for the last 3 Tuesdays, to tell you the stories of the campaign and all of its key players and key moments, and place a pivotal election in broader historical context. So let's get started. To set the stage for 1992, we need to go back a little earlier, to the 1980s. So let's go where we left off last Tuesday, Ronald Reagan's victory over Jimmy Carter in November 1980. Reagan's big win is seen by many as the beginning of a new conservative politics in Washington, D.C. But as we know from understanding the history of pivotal elections, like 1968, the conservative movement had been gathering steam for a couple of decades already. Another thing happened in 1980 that would have a big impact in 1992. In May of that year, a maverick television station owner named Ted Turner founded a 24-hour cable news channel called CNN. Cable TV was still very new, and most people were pretty skeptical that Turner's idea would fly. How many people would actually watch the stuff? How would they find enough news to fill 24 hours? Now let's move back to Ronald Reagan. Reagan had a rocky first term. The economy was still in the doldrums. His solution had been a bold program of tax cuts, spending cuts that came to be known as Reaganomics, not always charitably. The one place he beefed up government spending was in defense. As his re-election campaign loomed, Reaganomics didn't seem to be doing much to bring the economy back. Tensions between the US and the Soviets were rising. Democrats charged that Reagan was a warmongering president who favored the rich, punished the poor. Then Reagan got a little lucky. The economy started to slowly improve. While the Democrats kept bashing Reagan on economic issues, the Reagan people built a campaign around a positive, optimistic message that America was getting stronger and better. Let's take a look.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Reagan and his vision of morning in America won big in 1984, and the conservative revolution he led got stronger. Another thing that got stronger in the late 80s was the influence of money in politics on both sides of the aisle. To win, campaigns needed to buy lots of television time and hire top-notch advertising and political advertisers who could make ads like this one. These things cost money, and fundraising started to become a full-time job. Corporations and business groups formed political action committees to funnel money to politicians, and they gained access and influence in return. High-powered corporate lobbyists like Republican Michael Deaver became such prominent figures that they landed on the cover of national news magazines. Deaver was just one member of this big political industrial complex that was turning running for president into a full-time job for most lawmakers, especially for the people who are running for the highest office. Another player in this political industrial complex was the professional campaign strategist. And no strategist was more influential in the 80s than Lee Atwater. In 1988, Atwater was George H.W. Bush's campaign manager. He understood the power and importance of controlling the daily news cycle and was relentless in going after his political opponents. He once said, quote, "Any day you were not moving the ball forward, you were moving it backward." In 1988, Atwater is acknowledged to be the mastermind behind a series of hard-hitting TV ads portraying Democratic Governor Michael Dukakis, the nominee, as a weak-kneed failure. There was that one with Dukakis in a tank, an unfortunate photo op that Atwater exploited to the hilt. There was the infamous Willie Horton ad, which showed a menacing mugshot of a black felon let out of prison on a Massachusetts furlough program. Atwater perfected the art of playing on voters' fears about race, about the economy, about cultural elites stomping on individual rights. The Dukakis campaign didn't realize the importance of rapid response to these charges. George H.W. Bush became president. The 1980s helped lay the groundwork for the pivotal election of 1992. Why was 1992 a pivotal election? 3 reasons. 1, it marked the culmination of the Reagan Revolution, the move from progressive to conservative politics. 2, it marked the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. And 3, it was a campaign disrupted and shaped by a self-financed outsider whose run illuminated the changing role of money and business in politics and in American life. With the Reagan presidency, the ideas that once had seemed extreme became part of the political mainstream. And liberal ideas that had held strong since the New Deal started to lose credibility. One example of this changed politics was welfare reform. The program that delivered welfare to poor single-parent families was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. It had been around since the New Deal, and in terms of federal spending, it was a pretty small program. But by the late 80s, it had become a political punching bag. Ronald Reagan talked about welfare queens who used their welfare money to buy furs and Cadillacs. Conservatives condemned AFDC as a prime example of indulgent liberal social policy and government waste. And Democrats as well were starting to question whether AFDC really worked in bringing people out of poverty. It didn't seem to offer enough opportunity for parents to get the skills and training they needed to keep a steady job. Welfare seemed like one of those old liberal programs that needed reinvention. In 1988, a group of governors, both Republican and Democrat, came to Washington to urge Congress to pass welfare reform, to allow their states more flexibility in how they delivered this program. Their leader was the young Democratic governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. How about that hair? Clinton was one of the new generation of Democrats. These politicians were more fiscally conservative. They had experienced the Reagan Revolution, and they were taking some cues from its political playbook. They called themselves New Democrats, and their growing influence in DC had helped launch Clinton into the national spotlight. After losing with Dukakis in 1988, many in the Democratic Party started to argue that old school liberals were no longer able to win the White House. It was time for new blood, for new Democrats. In a way, this is reminiscent of 1912. Remember 1912? When Woodrow Wilson became the new Democrat who was going to help the Democrats come out of the political wilderness and win the White House again? But in 1992, however, the Democrats first had to defeat a sitting president who looked pretty hard to beat. George H.W. Bush was born into political power and economic privilege. His father, Prescott Bush, was a Wall Street banker who went on to serve as U.S. Senator from Connecticut. George Bush turned 18 the day of his prep school graduation. It was 1942. The next day, against his parents' wishes, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy and became its youngest pilot. He served 3 years. He went on 58 combat missions. On one of these, he was shot down by the Japanese and had to bail out over the Pacific, eventually rescued by a U.S. submarine. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his heroism under fire. After graduating from Yale after the war, Bush chose to leave New England behind and moved his family to Texas to seek his fortune in the oil industry. Bush's move to Texas gave him a front row seat in witnessing the changes underway in the Republican Party. When he first ran for Congress in 1964, however, he got branded as a northern carpetbagger, and he lost. But the changing demographics of Texas started to work in Bush's favor. More and more Republican voters were moving to cities like Houston and Dallas. And the Democratic Party was losing some of its power because of the policies of its liberals in Washington. So when Bush ran again in 1966 as a Republican moderate, he won. In the 1970s, Bush worked in a series of jobs in Washington that demonstrated his great party loyalty, as well as helped him develop a strong reputation as a leader in foreign policy. He served as Nixon's ambassador to China, Nixon's ambassador to the UN, and Ford's ambassador to China, and director of the CIA. And in between the Nixon and Ford gigs, he took on the head of the Republican National Committee right in the middle of Watergate. Talk about a good party guy. Bush first ran for president in 1980 as a more moderate alternative to the conservative Reagan. But 1980 was not the moderate's year, so he ended up accepting the vice presidential post. Bush did not have Reagan's masterful communication skills, nor did he share his straightforward conservative ideology. But he and Reagan became close to one another during their 8 years in the White House. They had lunches together often, and Bush had significant influence on the Reagan agenda, particularly when it came to foreign policy. And foreign policy was certainly the defining realm of Reagan's second term and Bush's first term. The two men presided over the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new world order. Reagan came into office with an aggressive stance against the Soviets, beefing up defense, referring to the USSR as an evil empire. He supported efforts to curb the spread of Marxist and socialist-leading governments around the world. This included Nicaragua, where a scheme to funnel arms to a conservative counterinsurgency would result in the Iran-Contra scandal, an affair in which both Reagan and Bush would be implicated. By the time Reagan left office, however, the US-Soviet relationship had changed. Reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had instituted policies of openness and economic change, glasnost and perestroika. Reagan and Gorbachev's summit meetings together in the late 1980s were headline-grabbing moments that foreshadowed the end of the Cold War. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the tearing down of the Iron Curtain happened in Bush's first year in office. But with the old Soviet enemy gone, a new set of threats rose to the forefront. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait in an attempt to gain the smaller nation's resources and its strategic position on the Persian Gulf. Bush mobilized an international coalition, including the Soviets, to halt the invasion and beat back Saddam Hussein's forces. Operation Desert Storm was a huge military and political triumph for George H.W. Bush. It was smooth, it was aggressive, it was quick. It showcased all the high-tech wonders of the U.S. military. Remembering how much negative press attention had hurt the American effort in Vietnam, the White House put strong restrictions on how the war could be reported. Journalists were embedded in military units, and their movements were strictly contained. Most reporters didn't even get to go into Iraq at all, but had to report from U.S. government facilities in Kuwait. When the war ended in March 1991, Bush's approval ratings were as high as 90%. What president doesn't want that? If 1992 had been about foreign policy, Bush would definitely have been the much stronger candidate. But 1992 became an election about the economy and the domestic agenda. In 1991, the U.S. economy started to struggle. For liberals, the slump seemed proof that the Republican economic policies didn't help the little guy. For conservatives, it reminded them that President Bush had promised not to raise taxes, famously saying in 1988, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Well, he went back on that promise, and conservatives were furious. George Bush didn't have the communication skills to turn a sour economy story into Morning in America. The person who managed to tell that story more persuasively in 1992 was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's background couldn't have been more different from that of George Bush. He was born in a small town in Arkansas to a single mom with few resources. He was very smart, very outgoing, and from childhood forward had this astounding ability to connect on a personal level with all sorts of different people. From a very early age, Bill Clinton had his eyes on a political career that nurtured this ambition. He went to Georgetown University, using scholarships and part-time jobs to pay his tuition. He then went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He came back to Yale Law School, where he met another extraordinary young person, Hillary Rodham. He brought Hillary back with him to Arkansas, where he ran for Congress in 1974. He lost, but he had a strong showing, and Democratic leaders in Arkansas pegged him as a young man to watch. He won the post of Attorney General in 1976, and then in 1978, at age 32, he became Arkansas governor. In Clinton's first term, he got ahead of himself. He thought he had a mandate for change. He brought in lots of young people like him to mix things up, do a lot of reform in a short period of time. There was a big generation gap at work. Arkansas was conservative. It was incremental. Arkansans looked at the long-haired young governor. They looked at his wife, who hadn't changed her last name when she got married. And so in 1982, it was only a 2-year term, Clinton lost. He and Hillary learned a lot from that loss. And when he came back to run again in 1984, he emphasized that he was a centrist, not a liberal. Hillary changed her last name. They both understood that he wasn't going to appeal to everyone, but that he could get enough votes to win. Clinton got reelected again and again, and he further strengthened this base. He was a master of retail politics. He was particularly effective at getting support from the black community while still getting strong support from whites. And Arkansas was perfect for this approach. It was and is very small. It had a population of about 2 million people. In the 1980s, Little Rock, the biggest city by far, had a population not too much more than 100,000. That's about the same size as Everett. That's about half the size of Tacoma or Spokane. George Bush was the inheritor of the Reagan mantle on the Republican side, but the career and the ascendance of Bill Clinton, the new Democrat, is really where we see the culmination of the Reagan Revolution. Clinton's centrist democratic ideas bore the influence of Reagan's beliefs about cutting government spending, about individual responsibility, about less regulation. Clinton also learned from Reagan the importance of communicating your message in an inspiring way. The worsening economy in 1991 started to hack away at George Bush's approval ratings, but they were still at 60% by the fall. Politicians in both parties thought the election of '92 was going to be won or lost on foreign policy. And Bush was solid on that front, so no big-name Democrat was willing to throw their hat in the ring. This opened things up for candidates of relatively lesser stature. There were 3 senators or former senators, Bob Kerrey of Nebraska, Paul Tsongas of Connecticut, and Tom Harkin of Iowa. There was a governor and a former governor, Doug Wilder of Virginia and Jerry Brown of California, who's now a current governor again. And then in early October 1991, there was another governor, Bill Clinton. He stood in front of the old State House in Little Rock and announced he was running for president. Now the second element of this story, the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. By 1992, CNN had gone from being Ted Turner's outlandish idea to being a serious news outlet whose influence radiated far beyond the size of its viewer audience, which was still much smaller than it became later. The Gulf War of 1990 and 1991 was the real moment that CNN moved into this influential position. This fast-moving and highly visual war was well-suited to the fast-paced rhythm of cable news. On air 24 hours a day, CNN was able to break stories before the networks could get to them. And CNN provided video content to local TV news outlets who were in fierce competition for ratings. CNN war reporters became celebrities. CNN's Arthur Kent delivered one report from Kuwait as Iraqi Scud missiles rained down and came to be known as the Scud Stud. You forgot about that one, didn't you? CNN continued to be a news breaker and a news maker in 1992. In late April, Los Angeles exploded into violence. An all-white jury had acquitted police officers accused of beating a black motorist, Rodney King. Angry residents lashed out at the injustice, turning their anger on local businesses, most of whom had white or Asian American owners. The images of a burning neighborhood, of looting and violence on the streets, flashed across TV screens and newspapers. And to get the latest, Americans turned to CNN. By this time, CNN had already made its mark on the presidential race. Texas billionaire H. Ross Perot went on CNN's Larry King Live to announce that if his supporters got him on the ballot in all 50 states, he'd run for president as a third-party candidate. Perot and CNN were tailor-made for each other. They both appealed to the anti-establishment, anti-government sentiment that had been on the rise since the 1970s. Vietnam and Watergate had shown Americans that their leaders were flawed, that they didn't always tell the truth. It was now the duty of reporters to break through the politicians' spin. It was the duty of politicians to talk straight to the people. Now, Perot entered the political game in 1992 as the ultimate outsider. He condemned career politicians for not understanding the issues, for being beholden to special interests, for forgetting the real Americans. But in reality, Perot was a creature of Washington. He had grown wealthy as the result of securing government contracts. He had gotten wealthier through the savvy lobbying of Congress to get more contracts and favors. One frustrated Bush campaign official complained that Perot, quote, was everything in real life that he was railing against in politics. But Perot positioned himself successfully as the outsider candidate. And CNN was something of the outsider media outlet. It was based in Atlanta, not in Washington. It relied on fresh TV reporting talent, not experienced newspaper reporters. With 24 hours to fill, it provided airtime to people and stories that the others didn't have time to cover. And with 24 hours to fill, it was able to dig deeper into all aspects of the people running for president. Because another hallmark of the post-Vietnam and post-Watergate era was that candidates' personal lives were fair game. Over the course of many decades, the relationship with the president and the voter had become much more personal. And after the 1970s, those stakes became even higher. The press didn't want to be caught flat-footed again. So relentless investigations into all dimensions of the candidates' lives, into their character, became an integral part of campaigning. Now, in 1992, print journalism was still very powerful, let's not forget that. But it too was influenced by the rise of cable. Now reporters had multiple deadlines per day. They had multiple stories to follow. As one Clinton campaign advisor put it, quote, "The press is just a giant monster that has to be continually fed. Either you feed it or it feeds on you." The Democratic primaries just showed just how powerful that giant monster could be. In late 1991, there were 6 declared candidates, but a lot of Democrats were waiting for someone better to come along. Many of them pinned their hopes on Mario Cuomo, the New York governor. Cuomo was a true liberal with the character and the gravitas needed to run for president. He was charismatic. He was big time. Clinton and the rest of the people running were kind of small time. For months, Cuomo had been sending signals about possibly running for president, yet he wouldn't come out one way or the other. His indecision gave him the nickname Hamlet on the Hudson. As the fall went on, Bush's approval ratings started going lower. And polls were taken about preferences for Democratic candidates, Cuomo kept on coming out on top. Even though he had a late start, it seemed like Cuomo had an opportunity to become the front runner if he got himself on the ballot in the first primary state, New Hampshire. The deadline for filing for candidacy in that primary was December 20th. And as luck would have it, that was a week that Cuomo was in the final budget negotiations with the state legislature in Albany. New York Republicans seized the opportunity to blast Cuomo for putting his political ambitions over the interests of his constituents. He had to stay in Albany and work out this budget. By the end of the day, on December 19th, there was still no budget deal. And New Hampshire law required Cuomo to file for candidacy in person. Reporters descended on Albany. CNN set up cameras on the tarmac at the airport, keeping watch on the plane the Cuomo people had chartered to fly him up to Manchester if need be. The story dominated CNN all day. The hours ticked by, looking at the plane, no Cuomo, another hour, no Cuomo, no Cuomo. And at 3:30, the governor made a public statement. The budget had to take priority over his presidential ambitions. He was out. The remaining candidates on the Democratic side soon learned the hazards of running for president in the age of the 24-hour news cycle. In January 1992, the race for New Hampshire was in full gear. But media attention swung to New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where a woman named Jennifer Flowers was telling the world about her longtime affair with Bill Clinton. In Arkansas in the 1980s, rumors about Clinton's personal life were so common that people really didn't pay too much attention to them. They were rumors, and that was it. In contrast, the Flowers revelation created a media firestorm. Like a lot of stories in politics, it became powerful because it substantiated a narrative that was emerging about Bill Clinton, that he was slick, that he would say anything to get elected, that he wasn't entirely truthful or forthcoming. It was also a powerful media moment because of the intersection between tabloid journalism and straight journalism. Jennifer Flowers went public because the Star Supermarket tabloid reportedly paid her more than $100,000 for her story. She fielded questions from reporters at this press conference, from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, as well as from a trash-talking DJ from the Howard Stern radio show. Clinton's currency sunk further when it was revealed that he had avoided the draft for Vietnam and seemed to have done it in a cagey way that was designed to preserve his political viability. Once again, it fed into a narrative that he was a candidate who might not be trusted. The pundits said it was over for Clinton. They underestimated him. They also underestimated the audacity of the Clinton campaign's spin machine. Clinton came in second in New Hampshire, behind Paul Tsongas. And his campaign advisors spun it not as a loss, but as a win, calling Clinton the comeback kid. The spin cycle worked both to Clinton's advantage and disadvantage to the primaries. The campaign didn't have a lot of cash, so they got the candidate on unusual media outlets where candidates hadn't gone before. Not too long after the violence in LA, Clinton appeared on Arsenio Hall's late-night talk show, wearing sunglasses and playing his saxophone. He went on MTV, answering questions from 20-somethings on serious and unserious topics. It worked. It was risky, but it worked. Clinton's campaign had more message discipline and understanding of the spin cycle than his competitors. They took advantage of the intersection between celebrity, tabloid journalism, and straight journalism. By the end of the primary season, Clinton prevailed. He won the Democratic nomination. And he capped it off with another made-for-TV moment, the announcement of Al Gore as his running mate. The Bush campaign staffers back in Washington watching this event on cable news cringed as they saw the pictures. It was a beautiful summer day in Little Rock. Against the red brick background of the Arkansas governor's mansion, in front of a group of cheering supporters, the Clinton and the Gore families stood together. They were picture perfect, blonde wives, smiling children, young candidates who already seemed like the best of friends. And by picking Gore, Clinton was actually going against the conventional wisdom about picking a vice presidential candidate. You really weren't supposed to pick someone like you. You weren't supposed to pick someone from the same region of the country. You were supposed to balance each other out. But both Clinton and Gore were betting on the fact that voters were ready for a new generation. They were ready for people who were young. They were ready for leaders who were moderate, who were fresh faces that hadn't been seen too much before. And it also mattered that both of them were from the South. In the years since Nixon's first victory in 1968, the South had become more and more Republican. Clinton from Arkansas, Gore from Tennessee. They were different kinds of Southern Democrats, ones who could appeal to both black and white voters. They weren't elite Northeastern liberals. They were sons of the South. The week after the Gore announcement, the Democrats had their convention in New York City, and unlike the Democratic conventions we've explored on these pivotal Tuesdays, amazingly, it was largely controversy-free and very slickly stage-managed. Afterwards, the Clintons and the Gores went on a multi-state bus tour that extended their post-convention bump. Things were looking up. But things weren't totally looking up, because Clinton still had a big image problem. People didn't like him or trust him. He had a 15% approval rating when you looked at the general electorate. The Clinton campaign ran focus groups to see what the problem exactly was. In Allentown, Pennsylvania, one woman in a focus group put it this way, quote, "Look, if you asked Bill Clinton what his favorite color is, he'd tell you plaid." Now, George H.W. Bush had problems as well. First, Bush had an unexpected primary challenge from the conservative Patrick Buchanan. You remember Buchanan from last Tuesday when he was working on the Nixon '68 campaign. Bush was part of the Reagan Revolution, but he was still seen as a moderate. He didn't throw red meat to the party base by talking much about social issues or religion. Buchanan, in contrast, was all red meat. In New Hampshire, Bush won, but Buchanan was competitive enough to make the media pay attention. The 24-hour news cycle played up the fact that the incumbent president might have weak support within his own party. So the Bush campaign fought back. The next big primary was in Michigan. The Bush people fed stories to the media about Buchanan owning a foreign car, a big no-no in the Motor City. Bush trounced Buchanan in Michigan, and that seemed to be the end of the Buchanan campaign's chances. But it wasn't the end of Patrick Buchanan in 1992. He gave a speech at the Republican convention in August that hard-right conservatives applauded, but it alarmed many other listeners, from moderate Republicans to liberals. He tore into both Hillary and Bill Clinton and the rest of the Democrats for promoting a dangerously liberal agenda. Here's an excerpt. There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side. Other speakers at the GOP convention sounded similar themes. They were playing to the base, not to the general electorate. The net result was that the Republicans seemed to be all about, while the Democrats were all about the economy. Running as an incumbent has advantages and it has disadvantages. The modern presidency is a bubble. Every minute of a president's day is scheduled. Protocol dictates what he can say and who he can say it to. People around him may be reluctant to be fully honest with him. And he has to hold down a full-time job while running for president. George Bush particularly disliked having campaign business pull him away from the job of governing. And he'd been in the White House bubble for 12 years. It was easy to see how he could seem out of touch. He also had two sets of staff people, in the White House and in the campaign, that often were at odds with one another. All through the first part of the campaign, they fought over message, over scheduling, over tactics, and it showed. The Bush campaign could not seem to get their footing in a race where the Cold War was no longer the big issue, which was about the economy, not about foreign policy, where the media rules had changed, and where the political math had changed. Because it was not a two-way race they were running in. It was a three-way race. The 1992 election turned out to be all about change. And for a lot of 1992, the person who really seemed like the change candidate was H. Ross Perot. Perot continued his Larry King appearances and press conferences through the spring of 1992. In mid-May, a national poll put him ahead of both Bush and Clinton in the presidential race. This got him serious. He stunned both Democrats and Republicans by hiring two of their own to run his campaign. One of them, Hamilton Jordan, had worked for Jimmy Carter. The other, Ed Rollins, had managed Ronald Reagan's 1984 Morning in America campaign. In late June, Clinton had surged ahead of Perot in national polls, but both of them still polled ahead of Bush. Perot's campaign was remarkable on many levels, but perhaps the most important was that it was the beginning of a new phenomenon in politics, the self-financed candidate. Campaigns were so expensive, and the ability of a candidate to campaign using their own money was a huge advantage. They didn't have to fundraise all the time, and they could pitch themselves to voters as an outsider, beholden to no one. And that's what Perot did. Now, both the Bush and the Clinton teams thought that Perot's money and self-financing would turn off middle-class voters, and it didn't. In a year where outsiders were what Americans wanted, Perot's self-financing told voters that he was truly independent. And his words and actions on the campaign reflected that. In contrast to the other stage-managed and highly messaged candidates, Perot came off as a folksy and plain-talking guy. The Bush campaign, in particular, underestimated Ross Perot. Bush's friends and advisors from Texas had known Perot for a long time, and they thought he was a crackpot. So they did little to acknowledge his candidacy, figuring that he would blow himself up at some point. This let the Perot momentum go unchecked for quite a while. But then, on the day after the end of the Democratic convention, the Bush people's assumptions came true. Perot abruptly announced he was dropping out. At first, the Bush people thought this was a huge boon to their campaign. It was not. The people who supported Perot were the people who wanted change. And with Perot out of the picture, they switched their allegiance to the other change candidate, Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton's campaign team knew they would need more message discipline and organization in the general campaign. They knew Bush's people were pros. By the summer, Bush had persuaded former Secretary of State James Baker to come in and run his campaign to end the infighting between the campaign side and the White House staff. The president was going to be a formidable competitor. Get his house in order. Too many people had the ear of the candidate. There were the old friends from Arkansas, there were the staff from the governor's mansion, the friends from New York and Washington, and then the paid campaign strategists and consultants. They needed focus, they needed organization. So they did two things. The first thing was that they decided to keep the campaign headquartered in Little Rock. The Clintons decided this partly because of their daughter Chelsea's school and sports schedule, but partly because putting everyone in Little Rock would reduce distractions. The Bush people were in Washington, where the campaign was a day job. The Clinton people were far away from their homes and social lives in a small southern city, which means that they worked all the time. When they left work, they would go to dinner with people from work, and they'd talk about work. Then they would go back to the office and work some more. They all slept in barely furnished apartments with each other when they weren't working. They ate out of vending machines. They functioned on very little sleep, bad food. They had no work-life balance whatsoever. They lived and breathed the 24-hour news cycle. The other critical decision that made after the convention was to establish a nerve center where all different parts of the campaign operation could be in constant communication and mobilized to rapidly respond to any breaking news. The Clintons tapped their firebrand campaign strategist, James Carville, to run the operation. The Nerve Center was the brainchild of Carville and of his fellow strategist, George Stephanopoulos, but Hillary Clinton gave it its name. She called it the War Room. You might say that the Bush people invented modern message discipline with the Gulf War, embedding reporters and tightly controlling the story. In 1992, the roles were reversed. The Bush campaign lost control of the story again and again. The Clinton War Room was all about message discipline. Carville posted a whiteboard in the middle of the War Room with the three main messages of the campaign. Change versus more of the same. The economy's stupid. And don't forget healthcare. And he built a whole operation to serve those messages. The War Room was about research and about doing investigations on the other candidate that the press didn't have the time to do. They were too busy filing multiple deadlines over a 24-hour period. 20-something researchers dug up facts about the Bush campaign and presidency that senior staffers leaked to reporters. They had people who shadowed the Bush campaign and kept track of everything said and promised. They relentlessly followed the news, with two staffers staying up all night to put together a daily briefing book of news clips from papers all over the country. The War Room got the whole campaign on message. Carville and Stephanopoulos held War Room meetings twice a day at 7:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. Anyone in the building, anyone on the campaign was welcome to come. And every day, everyone crowded into the War Room to listen to these briefings, to hear the message, to hear what was going on. And message discipline was the result. Now, the 1992 campaign was fueled on this spin, on this message discipline, but it was also fueled on money. As Election Day got closer, buying television time became more and more important. Both Bush and Clinton knew that getting on television can make the difference between a win and a loss in critical states. So let's now turn to one of Clinton's ads and see what he was selling on TV.
Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've called for an end to welfare as we know it, so welfare can be a second chance, not a way of life. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty, and they rejected the old tax and spend politics. Clinton's balanced 12 budgets, and they proposed a new plan investing in people, detailing $140 billion in spending cuts they make right now. Clinton Gore, for people, for a change.
hope, instead of policy positions that could have been Republican ones in 1968. In contrast, George Bush was selling experience and incumbency. Let's take a look.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military.
President Bush said today that he reassured Mr. Yeltsin the United States would stand by democracy.
If revolutionaries and terrorists are armed with nuclear and chemical weapons, it may pose new challenges to the president.
In a world where we're just one unknown dictator away from the next major crisis, who do you most trust to be sitting in this chair?
The importance of buying television time became even clearer in the final weeks. Because 33 days before the election, Perot got back in the race. Once again drawing on his personal wealth, he bought 30-minute slots of time on the major TV networks for infomercials delivering his message. In a world of sound bites and talking points, Perot gave extended policy talks to his audience, armed with a pointer and a series of charts displaying key data. He talked about the looming problem of the budget deficit, about free trade, about the war on drugs. He assailed both Bush and Clinton for ignoring these issues. He talked about jobs going overseas. He slammed Republican trickle-down economics, and then he also said that Clinton was going to raise taxes on ordinary Americans. Neither party was going to do the right thing. Perot remained a distant third in the race, but his presence forced the two major candidates to address new issues, the budget deficit chief among them. His presence in the debates also threw the usual format off kilter. Bush and Clinton had smoothly prepared answers. Perot spoke informally and without regard for typical political platitudes. Here's part of one of these debates, which Perot turned into a television commercial.
Pretty simply, who's the best qualified person up here on the stage to create jobs? Make your decision and vote on November the 3rd. I suggest you might consider somebody who's created jobs. Second, who's the best person to manage money? I suggest you pick a person who's successfully managed money. Who's the best person to get results and not talk? Look at the record, make your decision. And finally, who would you give your pension fund and your savings account to manage? And last one, who would you ask to be the trustee of your estate and take care of your children if something happened to you? Finally, to you students up there, God bless you, I'm doing this for you. I want you to have the American dream. And to the American people, I'm doing this because I love you. That's it.
What a contrast from the smooth, sophisticated ads put together for both Bush and Clinton. In a world where TV political ads had gotten so slick, Perot was the opposite of slick, and that broke him through the clutter. Perot continued to be an unpredictable force in the final weeks. His erratic personality began to shine through. He went on 60 Minutes and said his withdrawal in the summer had been the result of Republican operatives plotting to disrupt his daughter's wedding. He didn't provide any evidence, so he started to seem rather paranoid. George Bush must have been deeply frustrated by how the campaign was going. Think about it. Here he was, a war hero, an experienced policy leader, a sitting president, and he was lagging behind a draft-evading, double-talking, small-time governor of a small-time state. The return of Perot made it even worse. Everyone in Texas knew that Perot was a little loony, and he was being taken quite seriously as a political equal. What was going on? On October 15th, at a debate with a town hall format, Bush was listening as Clinton ran over time and answering a question. Perhaps trying to send a signal to the moderator or maybe quite annoyed at having to share the stage with two undisciplined and unworthy competitors, Bush glanced at his watch. The media beast pounced on that one. Here was an incumbent who already seemed out of touch. His campaign seemed running on autopilot. He didn't seem to care about Americans' economic plight. And here he was checking his watch during the debate as if to say, when can I get out of here? Bush got tired and testy during those last weeks on the road. In one speech, he called Clinton and Gore bozos. When some pro-Clinton hecklers interrupted another event, he said, I wish those draft dodgers would shut up so I could deliver my speech. He attacked the media as well, bashing them for covering Clinton so uncritically. He held up a favorite bumper sticker, reading, "Annoy the media, re-elect Bush." Bashing the mainstream media became such a theme for the campaign that audience started hissing at reporters when they showed up at Bush rallies. The race was still a tough one. A lot of states remained in play in the final days. Yet on the Friday before the election, exactly 20 years ago today, in fact, the Bush campaign was dealt a fatal blow. The independent prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, who had been investigating the Iran-Contra affair, came out with a report implicating President Bush in the scandal. He had said he was out of the loop. Walsh said he knew all along. It was the classic October surprise. The Bush team saw political motives in its timing. But both sides sensed that the election was over. The mood in Little Rock became celebratory. Supporters and reporters and all sorts of political hangers-on streamed into Little Rock over the very last days of the campaign. They were ready for a big party on election night. And here's what election night looked like. The final tallies: Clinton got 370 electoral votes, buoyed by his win of California, a huge win. Bush won 168 electoral votes. Perot, none. But like Woodrow Wilson 80 years earlier, Clinton won with a plurality, not a majority, getting 43% of the popular vote. Bush got 37.4%, and Perot got a bigger chunk of the popular vote than any third-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt, 18.9%. Election night in Little Rock was exhilarating, electric. It was a crisp southern autumn night, no rain, and exuberant Democrats from all over the country converged on Little Rock. It was time to celebrate a return from 12 years of White House exile. Some had cameras. No one had cell phones or smartphones. Only the most important staff people had pagers. Many people wore suits and ties, even though it was evening, even though it was outside, even though it was Little Rock. Clinton gave his victory speech at the front of the old State House, the same place he'd announced his run 13 months earlier. He and Gore stood with their wives, and then they came forward to lean into the crowd of staff and supporters afterwards. Everyone there understood they were part of history. I understood I was part of history. Now that 20 years has passed, we have enough distance to think about what it all means. So why was 1992 a pivotal election? It marked the culmination of the Reagan Revolution. Over the course of the past 4 weeks, we've tracked an American political system that has moved to the left, then moved further to the left, then started to move right. We end with the end of the liberal progressive era of politics and the solid establishment of a new right to moderate set of politics. Democrats realized that New Deal liberalism could no longer win elections. Republicans were pushed further to the right by cultural conservatism. Now, taking the long view, shows us how dynamic the American political spectrum can be. It moved left, it moved right. It will likely change again and again. Second, 1992 marked the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. The relentless spin of news had a decisive effect on the 1992 race, and it's only sped up further since then. Now we not only have one cable news network, we have many. What's more, we have the internet. The rise of the internet has fragmented and sped up news even more. We can see the beginnings of all of this frenetic activity in the 1992 campaign. And last, we have the impact of the self-financed outsider, the first of many. Ross Perot defied all expectations. Political pros did not think voters would like this guy, a rich guy buying his own campaign. Instead, people liked the idea that Perot was not beholden to special interests. He went on cable, he bought airtime to talk about issues that he thought other candidates ignored. And his attention got them to take issues like deficit reduction seriously. In Clinton's first year in office, he pushed through a budget plan that had deficit reduction as a major component. In 3 of our 4 pivotal elections, a third-party candidate has shaken up the race. Their stories remind us that even when third parties don't win, they have an indelible effect on what plays out, and they leave their mark on the 2 major parties. Before I end tonight, I want to talk about what happens after Election Day. After the excitement of all these pivotal Tuesdays dissipates, there are the weighty duties of the Oval Office. On January 21st, 1993, it was Bill Clinton's first day as president, and it was my first day working in the White House. The West Wing is smaller in person, kind of like movie stars. It has the proportions of an early 19th century home. The stairs between the floors are about 2 people wide, as you can see from this photo of our current president and vice president. So if another person comes in the other direction, there has to be a sideways scoot and excuse me, so it was on this staircase that I came face to face with the newly inaugurated president and vice president of the United States, taking their first circuit around their new digs. Clinton, who never forgets a name or a face, greeted me warmly, and Gore did as well. It all seemed so ordinary and so very extraordinary. As I stood there on the West Wing stairs, I realized that someone who was just an ordinary guy, someone that I knew, was now the leader of the free world, launched into a job where there is no training manual. The whole political system and a lot of the history books that write about it tend to elevate the presidents to otherworldly status. We forget that they are fallible and quirky and moody and petty and impetuous and kind and good-hearted. They're just like any of the rest of us, to some degree. As I went on to work 4 more years in government, what these leaders do matters tremendously. Like it or not, the government touches nearly every part of our lives. And the decisions made at the top and the political philosophy that drives it filters down in profound ways. It not only matters who is president, but it matters who is governor, and mayor, and state senator, and city council member, and on and on and on. And they only get there and stay there because of us, because we vote, because we stay informed, because we pay attention, and we expect the people who lead us to pay attention as well. So our first Tuesdays in November are pivotal, not just because of the women and men who get elected, but because of the women and men who elect them. So when you fill out your ballots for this year's election, remember, you are making history. Thank you very much. as we do every Tuesday, if those of you who need to go, you're welcome to go, and but I'm happy to stay and take questions for a bit. And there are a couple of microphones in the aisle, and just step up and ask your question, and we can chat. And but before we do get to that, I'm just put your attention to the last slide on the screen. I wanted to have the URL for my website that has further reading about all 4 of these elections, and other reading about politics is up there. And there are other links to sites about things like electoral reform, electoral college reform, some of the questions that I've gotten from some of you in this hall and outside of it. I've put together a series of resources for you guys to review at your leisure. So thanks. Yes?
Hi. You mentioned how Bill Clinton in his campaigning used maybe obscure forms of media, and it reminded me of Obama using new forms like Facebook, Twitter, and most recently Reddit. Do you think that them using these new forms of media are why they became so popular and maybe why they won? Could you maybe compare the 2 time periods?
So the political use of that media makes them popular? I think that there's definitely a symbiotic relationship, or probably the candidates are usually a little behind the popular culture. So, MTV becomes popular, and that's why Clinton goes on it, right? But candidates go to new media in a way to punch through the clutter, to find a way to get their message to different sets of voters. And part of it is the way that we have now the long tail of media. We have all this very, very specialized media that goes to different parts of the electorate. So candidates really need to think even more strategically about where they go and how they go. And of course, there are limited resources too. So the great beauty of the internet and the great beauty of new media is usually that it's cheaper media. So using Reddit as opposed to buying time on a local television station is a lot cheaper, makes your money go a lot further. Whether it has the same impact, I think it's hard to measure when these media are so new, how much of an impact they have.
Well, I mean, he crashed Reddit, so I think he did a pretty good job, at least on people who were on it all the time, but thank you.
There you go. Yes?
Yes, you've given us a rich narrative. I think you mentioned starting in the 1870s, was it, through Wilson, that we largely had Republican control of the White House, and then from Roosevelt up until Nixon, Democratic control predominantly. And since we've had kind of an oscillating circumstance, and each of these pivotal elections has been determined by this preceding history. So I'm just wondering if you can project at all into the future what criteria might constitute a pivotal Tuesday going forward.
A pivotal Tuesday going forward. Well, this is why I'm a historian. I look backward, I don't project forward. I can tell you what happened. I don't deign to say what might happen. But I think, as you've as one of the things that's become clear from these 4 lectures is that the electoral math matters a lot, whether we like it or not, and that there's a, I guess the only thing I can say is watch Ohio and see how quickly Virginia dries out. So. Those are going to be pivotal, and sadly we are not. So thus we are spectators, not participants. But other important races going on nonetheless. Yeah. Yes.
It seems that one of the things that made the '92 election very pivotal was the generational change. That prior to that, all of the presidents, the recent ones from Kennedy on, had all fought in World War II and had been part of that. Greatest generation, and Clinton and Gore both represented a sharp break with that tradition. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, it was a generational change that, and that was just really profound, and the contrast between, and it cut both ways, right? So you have George H.W. Bush, the war hero, versus Clinton, the Vietnam era. The candidate who really has to wrestle with, serving in Vietnam, smoking marijuana, and there's a very interesting sort of the turn that you have, even in the trajectory of Clinton's career, where he first, one of the reasons he gets in trouble on the draft. I'm sorry, he gets in trouble on the, I didn't inhale smoking marijuana in Oxford, is that when he first ran for Congress in 1974. he was asked a question, and his answer was classic obfuscation. I never broke the laws of this country. So he didn't sort of deny, but it was sort of a non-denial denial. So he's already kind of in this odd place of people knew that he had done something. And so he couldn't come out and say, I never did it. And in 1992, now it's become, in part he kind of got himself in this corner because he had these earlier statements in the 70s when it really would have been a campaign killer. And then by 1992, it's less of a volatile issue. It's not like people would have not, Al Gore and others of his generation had said, yeah, I smoked pot and that wasn't a big deal. But it was the, as we learned with Watergate, it's not the lie, it's the cover-up. And he had a really sticky situation. But thinking about the change candidate and the youth of Clinton and Gore, although people had polarized feelings about them, and one of, Clinton is always someone about, 60% love him, 40% hate him. There are not a lot of undecideds in Clinton world. And that was true in Arkansas in the 80s. There were people who really, really, really hated him. And nonetheless, they had this generational appeal and this relatability because the baby boomers had, they were sort of tired of having their dads being in charge. It was ready for a new generation. So it was very much generational, and we see a lot of, but it still was at this inflection point where some of the old issues and the old litmus test issues still mattered, and they couldn't quite embrace the baby boom generation as much as they hoped or wanted to. Yes?
During the summer of 1992, while you were on the campaign trail, I was at the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. It was a very interesting and educational summer.
Yeah.
The folks at the Heritage hated the Clintons, and I emphasize the plural because I think they hated Hillary more than they hated Bill.
Yes.
They thought that Perot, as you mentioned, they thought Perot was a loony.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they also thought that Bush had betrayed the Reagan legacy, by agreeing to raise fees and taxes, and so they were effectively sitting out the election.
Yeah.
And it was the year because, they were almost daily lunchtime guests that I got to have lunch on a regular basis with Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, because this is the year that the contract with America was written.
Yeah.
It didn't take effect until 2 years later.
Yeah.
But it seems that 1992 may have been the year when the polarization in Congress really, got going. And I'm wondering whether the defeat of Pat Buchanan, which obviously was a blow to these, to the strong conservatives, really whether they're sitting out the whole process and focusing on Congress had any sort of impact, serious impact on the election.
That's a great series of observations, and it makes me think of three things. One is that part of George Bush's problem, that you've looked at the number of votes he got in 1992 versus 1998, it was the delta was in the millions. There were just many, many fewer people voting for Bush in 92. There were a lot of people sat out the election. So he lost a lot of numbers, a lot of support. His turnout was down. The second thing is that, to understand Buchanan's speech at the convention and the speeches at the other speeches at the Republican convention, which seemed to most people watching at home like, whoa, that's big stuff. He was speaking to the guys at the Heritage Foundation who were like, I'm sitting this one out. And it was really trying to galvanize that base, and they didn't manage to do that. That Bush never really brought those guys around. He tried after the convention to kind of get out there and say things, but it just sounded so alien coming out of his mouth. I mean, Bush was I think a man who takes his, he's a churchgoer, but he's high Episcopalian. He's you don't talk about church outside of church. It's just George Bush. And he, on one campaign speech in late summer, he goes on, he says, the Democratic Party platform was missing 3 important letters, G-O-D. And that had the effect of kind of alienating people who didn't like someone like they thought George Bush is a moderate, and I like that he doesn't talk about religion and God all the time. And then the people who cared about that stuff were like, this guy's disingenuous. He's just kind of, he's waffling. So you have but the congressional stuff is I think, the most important thing to take away, because, when we talk about the 92 being the culmination of the Reagan Revolution, what it does is it gives Gingrich an army and the architects of the contract with America, it galvanizes that movement. They're able to do what they do to sort of rally their base, to create this new alternative vision of national governance, because the guy in the White House is a Democrat, has a very different vision. And yes, Hillary was a key advisor throughout the campaign. And if you thought she, that was a good thing, and you thought that you were a supporter of the campaign, then that was a good thing. But those who were, people saw that as just really, that Clinton's talking all this sort of centrist stuff, but Hillary's really, a true Northeastern liberal. She's an uber liberal feminist trying to push this agenda stealthily. And so I think the conservative critique of the Clintons was like, well, look at how much his wife is having to do with setting the agenda. They're really liberals in disguise. They're just fooling you. They're not really the centrists they're pretending to be. Yeah, thank you. Question?
You alluded to Bush seeming out of touch, and there were a couple things that I recall, and I wonder if you could comment on them, whether they were significant or not. I think one of them, he went into a supermarket, and he didn't know the price of whatever it was, something we all buy every day. But maybe more importantly, there was I think it was the Family Leave Act, and he didn't seem to understand that that was really important to American families, whereas Clinton did.
Yeah.
Do you?
Well, the supermarket checkout thing, I think was a photo op gone bad. He was at this trade show that had all these kind of gee whiz new electronic equipment that you could use to do this, that, and the other. And I think that he was just trying to be nice. He was like, oh, gee whiz, yeah, that's really great. Wow, that's cool. But it fed into, again, feed into a narrative. So there's already this narrative that, all right, Bush has been in the White House bubble for 12 years. He's kind of this mealy-mouthed, wimpy, moderate guy. He's not a tough guy. He's not Reagan. He's not conservative, and he's out of touch. He hasn't had to drive a car, and it's true. But it was probably a little unfair that he got that was kind of became the spin on that particular incident, because I think he might have been just being polite to the people who were organizing it. That's my take on it. But on domestic policies, generally family leave, and then also when at the same town hall meeting where he looked at his watch, he was asked about the national debt, and it was actually a question that was, I think the woman was really asking kind of about the economy, the effect of the economic slump on families, and he just didn't have a good answer to it. He kind of gave this technocratic answer because he didn't really understand the question. Whereas Clinton, sort of this intuitive politician, I feel your pain, was much more kind of got it when he had those sort of dialogues. And Bill Clinton is such a sort of otherworldly. He's just so extraordinarily charismatic. Whether you like him or you don't like him, this guy's got charisma. I mean, Newt Gingrich was someone who was like, man, I love this guy. Like you get in his aura, and you just feel the love. And he is, and I think anyone suffers who doesn't have that charisma suffers side by side. I think that was part of Al Gore's problem in 2000, because you had, Clinton, I love you, man, and then Al Gore's more like, all right, here's the facts, and he's more of a normal person. Doesn't have this hyper, both the Clintons actually are just sort of about remembering names and faces. They are unbelievable. They remember everybody. If Bill Clinton was standing right here and talking, he would remember all y'all. He would be like, oh, how you doing? He's really good. He's really good. So, yeah.
We had some understanding that there had been bad blood historically in Texas between Perot and Bush, and maybe a reason that Perot decided to run. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can't comment too much on that, like with sort of, insider knowledge, because I wasn't an insider on those campaigns, but I do think that they did go way back, that there were a lot of, certainly people around Bush that knew Perot quite well, but I don't know about a sort of personal beef between the guys. But they, they're two just very, very different people. They kind of come from different backgrounds. I think Bush also had this, faux Texan problem among Texans. He was really just a New England preppy, pretending to wear a cowboy hat and cowboy boots and eat, onion rings or pork rinds, and but that was kind of a fake thing. So that might be part of what Perot didn't like about him. And Perot was, well, look, anyone who runs for president's got a big ego. Perot definitely had an inflated sense of self.
Following up on something that two of the audience members have said, one about the change from the World War II generation to the baby boomer generation, and then also kind of reactions to Hillary Clinton. Could there have been a generational gap between the role of women, women in the public eye, women in the campaign, and how people then regarded her role in things?
Yes. She was such a polarizing figure, and she was someone who was loved so deeply, and it is loved so deeply by some people, and then and also hated by others, because of her gender, because of her background. I think 1992 was called the Year of the Woman in politics, which kind of makes me chuckle. I mean, it was called the Year of the Woman because there were an unusual number of women running. It's the year of Patty Murray as first elected senator. And there were some really high-profile wins. There were quite a few women running for Senate. Carol Moseley Braun wins in Illinois. Lynn Yackel doesn't win in Pennsylvania. And so there's this feeling like, and also I think that there's a feeling among sort of the baby boom generation of women who are Democrats or fans of Hillary Clinton and feel kind of a common bond with her, that this is a breakthrough, that you have finally, just like the baby boom and are now running for president, you have the baby boom women kind of coming along with them. And certainly Hillary had she had a very close circle of very high-powered, kind of extraordinary women like her who were with her. But it was, the kind of the venom that was unleashed on her, both during the campaign and subsequently, I think revealed how deeply uncomfortable so many people in the political establishment or around it felt about her power. She had her unelected power. I think it's really complicated the role of First Lady since. I think both Laura Bush and Michelle Obama have gone to great lengths to kind of contain their roles as advisors or their public profiles and the way that they craft their, what issues are theirs. Because of course Hillary goes on to kind of be given healthcare reform. Again, these are sort of things that to those who like the Clintons, they think it's wonderful, and those who don't say this is evidence of, why this is all wrong. But she really became the kind of the punching bag for all of these things, these anxieties that people had about the social change that the Clintons represented, both this new generation and this kind of tolerance, this cultural relativism, cultural elitism, openness to alternative lifestyles of all kinds, and she kind of became the target for it. Yeah.
Thank you for some excellent lectures. I was reflecting back on all four of these and the uses of different forms of media that were dominant in different campaigns, whether it was with radio, then TV, and then different 24-hour TV, and then new media, then the internet, especially 4 years ago, that was used so masterfully. And now I'm seeing more and more how individuals are starting to make their own ads. Like, this gentleman from Hungary who's, talking about socialism, and reminds me of T. Boone Pickens not long ago talking about what he thinks energy policy should be. So do you think we are shifting into more of an individual market for advertising or promoting different ideologies and positions? I mean, not everybody's going to have the resources to do that, but that seems to be a new phenomenon to me, that individuals are buying airtime to express their views about the election, about different positions.
Well, I would ascribe it to the broader trend of kind of the end of mass culture and the beginning of a very, very sort of individualized, tailored culture, which has really been going on in the 40-some years since. So think about the 1968 election, where you have 3 television networks, everyone's watching, the nightly news with Walter Cronkite or the other two. There's sort of this, people are watching the same things, they're consuming the same media. There's this mass culture, and as the political culture starts breaking apart and being more about individual rights, individual identity, and identity as, you know, because of your gender or your race or your region or your ethnicity or your religion, as opposed to just being American, is paralleled by this breakup in the culture and this explosion of new media outlets. And part of it is technology driven. We have, now it's really even, you know, it's easier now than it was even 4 years ago to upload your own video to YouTube. And it doesn't require technological savvy to do it. We have the tools, we have the devices, and I think that, you know, we haven't really figured out what this all means and what this will mean for politics, and we'll have to see how it plays out. I think there's still going to be a role for the spin machine and the messaging and the overarching, the pros. They're going to figure out a way to work this, to make it, you know, work for them. So never underestimate a campaign strategist. They'll figure out a way. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It's who knows? It's the future. So, well, thank you all so much. I'm happy to talk a little more to you one-on-one after. Thank you.
If you would like to purchase a copy of the Pivotal Tuesday History Lecture Series, please email info@uwtv.org or call 206-685-1311 to place your order. For more, visit washington.edu/history or via the Twitter handle @MargaretO'Mara.